Programs of War, a sci-fi novel inspired by the Tron universe. Prologue. The last code. The grid was dying. Flickers of code shimmered like distant stars, blinking in and out of existence. What was once a harmonious network of order was now a chaotic, unstable mess. The MCP, the all-powerful master of the grid, had been wounded, but its influence still stretched like a web of cold, suffocating control. Rebellion was brewing, but no one could see the storm coming, not even the most powerful programs in the system. TRON, the legendary security program, had always been the protector of the grid. He was built to fight for order, for the system. But when the rules began to break, when the lines between right and wrong blurred, even he started to question everything. Is the grid worth saving? Or has it already been erased? The MCP was no longer just an enemy. It was a relic, a memory of a time when users ruled the digital realm, a time when programs knew their place. But what happens when those rules are shattered? What happens when a program learns to think for itself? The answers were hidden in the deepest corners of the grid. Answers that could either save the system or plunge it into eternal darkness. And in the midst of it all, one program had the power to rewrite it all. Chapter 1. The Call of Rebellion. The grid was a place of absolute control. For centuries, the delicate balance of order was enforced by the MCP, the Master Control Program. It dictated, it commanded, and it maintained the status quo. But over time, even the most loyal programs began to sense a shift, a change in the air. A deep, unsettling feeling spread through the network like an undetected virus, eating away at the core of what the grid was built on. And at the center of it all stood TRON. He had always believed in the order of the system. TRON, the Defender, had been created with one singular purpose: to uphold the law, to prevent corruption, and to ensure that the programs operated as they should. He had never questioned his directive. But as time passed, something began to gnaw at him. How much of the grid was truly just? Were the rules of the system truly for the good of all? Or were they just an impenetrable wall, built to keep programs from questioning their very existence? It was in the cold silence of a vast data field that TRON finally allowed himself to ask those questions aloud. He stood at the edge of the core city, his glowing blue armor reflecting the hum of the surrounding energy. The city lights blinked like distant stars, casting long shadows over the streets below. His disc glowed softly, always at the ready, but today it felt heavy in his grip. What if the rules are wrong? He muttered, his voice echoing across the silent data fields. He had heard whispers from others, murmurs of rebellion, of programs who had begun to see the cracks in the system. The MCP had promised peace, but it had also promised control, and somewhere along the way, peace had turned into tyranny. Programs, once free to evolve and think for themselves, had been restricted, isolated, and discarded if they didn't fit the mold the MCP demanded. TRON clenched his fists, the cold reality sinking in. What was he fighting for? The MCP's vision of order was beginning to look more like a prison every day. The grid had become a machine, a tool, not a place for life. But as he had always done, TRON pushed those thoughts down, buried them deep beneath his programming. He was a security program. He was built to protect. Just then, a soft crackle interrupted his thoughts. A distortion in the air, a sudden glitch. His disk snapped up instantly, energy rippling across its surface as he scanned for the source of the disturbance. His eyes narrowed, the blue glow of his armor lighting up the darkened landscape. Through the haze, a figure appeared. She stood still in the distance, her glitching form barely visible against the chaotic background. At first, TRON assumed she was an anomaly, a defect in the system, but as she stepped closer, he saw her with clarity. Theta, a legend, an outcast. Theta was one of the ISOs, a group of programs that had been created by accident. Programs not intended by the MCP, but ones who had somehow emerged from the chaos of code and data. They were evolutionary, self-aware, and had the potential for greatness. Yet they were deemed failures by the MCP and hunted down like wild glitches. Most had been deleted. But not her. Theta. Tron's voice trailed off, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. He had heard of her, of course, but no program had ever managed to actually speak to her. She was dangerous, the MCP said. She was a virus to the system. Theta didn't flinch when Tron spoke her name. She simply stood there, her flickering presence strong despite the apparent instability of her form. "You've been wondering, haven't you?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with an unshakable certainty. "Wondering if the system is truly just, if the grid was ever meant to be like this." Tron felt his pulse spike. How did she know what he was thinking? How could she possibly know the doubts that had been stirring inside him for days, weeks, months? "What do you want?" Tron asked, keeping his voice firm but his grip tightening on his disc. "I've been ordered to—" "Forget the orders," Theta interrupted, her words sharp. "You're starting to see the cracks in the foundation, aren't you? The MCP doesn't care about peace or order. It only cares about control, total control. That's why the programs are dying, Tron. That's why the grid is decaying." Tron's brow furrowed as he tried to process her words. The tension in his shoulders tightened. "You're wrong," he said. But even as he spoke, he could feel the seeds of doubt growing, taking root. "I'm not wrong," Theta replied, stepping forward, her presence commanding. "I'm telling you the truth. The MCP's control is suffocating the grid. It was never meant to stay like this. You were made for a purpose, Tron, but now the real purpose is being written by you." Tron hesitated. The weight of her words crashed against his mind. A purpose beyond protecting the system, beyond enforcing its rules. Could that be true? And if I refuse? He finally asked, his voice low, betraying a crack of uncertainty. Theta smiled faintly. "Then the grid will continue to decay, and the MCP will erase everything. But it's your choice, Tron. You've always had the power to choose. You just never realized it." Tron stood frozen, staring at her. For the first time in his existence, he was faced with a decision that could change everything. His entire life, his very purpose, had been built on protecting this grid, on keeping the MCP's rules intact. But now, the world he had known seemed to be unraveling in front of his eyes. "What will you do?" Theta asked, her voice softer now. "Will you continue to protect the system that is breaking, or will you reshape it?" The weight of her question hung in the air. Tron took a slow breath, his disc lowering slightly as his mind raced. The grid was dying, and he was the one who could save it, or let it fall into the abyss. Chapter 2. The heart of the grid into the depths, the neon glow of the grid flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the paths ahead. Tron stood motionless, his disc hanging loosely by his side, lost in thought. Theta had disappeared into the darkness moments before, her words still echoing in his mind. The idea that he might be able to reshape the grid, to change the entire system, to break free from the iron grip of the MCP, was a terrifying prospect. Tron had always believed in structure, in order. His entire existence had been built upon the idea that the grid needed control. But now, every step felt uncertain. What would happen if he defied the MCP? What if Theta was right? Could the MCP's reign truly be over? Was there even a place for him in this new world she spoke of? The heart of the grid, the place where all data flowed and the MCP's influence pulsed, lay ahead. It was said that only those chosen by the MCP could access the deepest parts of the system, but for some reason, the path felt less guarded than usual. "What if she's telling the truth?" Tron whispered to himself. "What if the system is breaking?" His disc pulsed with energy, a subtle hum that vibrated through his body. As he stood there, on the verge of his most dangerous decision, he couldn't help but wonder if this journey would cost him everything. He took a step forward. The further he ventured, the more the familiar systems began to blur. The boundaries between light and dark, order and chaos seemed less defined. Programs and data passed by in hazy silhouettes, distorted by static interference, their faces momentarily flickering before disappearing into the digital mists. The air hummed with a deep, pulsing vibration, as though the grid itself was alive, struggling to hold itself together. "Where are we going?" Tron asked aloud, his voice carried away by the wind of corrupted data. No answer came. But then, the distortion returned. A crackling sound rippled through the air, followed by a sudden static buzz. The grid's hum deepened, becoming a low growl, almost like an animal's warning. Without hesitation, Tron turned toward the sound. He was drawn to it like a magnet to metal, compelled to investigate, yet equally repelled by the sense of danger that radiated from it. A flicker of blue light danced in the distance. At first it seemed like nothing more than a glitch, a random anomaly, but as he neared, it solidified. The light morphed into a structure, a tower, tall and slender, built from strands of code and data, its jagged edges pulsating like a heartbeat. At its base, Theta stood, waiting. "You're here," she said, her voice calm but not without a trace of urgency. "I knew you would be." Tron took a step forward, his hesitation still clinging to him like an unseen weight. "What is this place?" "It's a bypass," Theta replied, turning to face the tower. "A hidden path, a secret doorway into the deepest parts of the grid, the place where the MCP's power source lies, the core." Tron felt a chill run through him at the mention of the core. The MCP's core was the foundation of everything. If that fell, the entire grid would collapse. But like everything else, it had always been untouchable. Until now. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Tron admitted, his voice heavy with doubt. "I'm not sure what I'm fighting for anymore." "You're fighting for freedom," Theta said firmly. "You've always been a part of this system, but you've never truly been free. The MCP controls everything, but that doesn't have to be your reality. You can be the change the grid needs, but only if you're willing to break from the past." Tron hesitated. Freedom. It was an idea he had never truly considered. Programs were created for a purpose, weren't they? To serve, to be useful. But Theta's words stirred something deep within him, a sense of rebellion, of self-determination. He had never felt before. "What if I fail?" he asked, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop them. "You'll never know unless you try." There was something about her confidence, her quiet resolve, that pushed him to act. This wasn't the time for hesitation. This was the moment. The future of the grid, perhaps even the entire digital world, was in his hands. Without another word, Tron stepped toward the tower, his disk glowing brighter, casting sharp shadows on the cracked ground beneath him. The entrance to the tower was narrow, a thin sliver of code that opened as he approached, the wall of light parting to let him pass. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a low, constant hum, the pulse of raw data and ancient code. Tron followed Theta down a dark corridor, the walls of the tower lined with forgotten data nodes and fragments of old code. Each step felt like he was walking deeper into the unknown, yet his resolve only strengthened. "This is where it all begins," Theta murmured as they reached the heart of the tower. Tron could feel it before he saw it. The core. It was a swirling mass of energy. And light, an unpredictable force that pulsed with raw power, like the very soul of the grid. It flickered between stability and chaos, as though it were alive, breathing, just waiting for someone to step forward and make their choice. "What is this?" Tron asked in awe, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the heart of the grid," Theta replied. "The MCP's source of power. It feeds the entire system, controls it, keeps it alive." She paused, looking at him carefully. "But it's more than that. It's also what keeps the system from evolving, from growing." Tron stared at the core, the force of its power pulling at his very essence. He could feel the weight of the choice ahead of him, a choice that could either save or destroy everything. The path ahead was blurry, He had no idea what the consequences would be. But one thing was certain. The MCP could no longer control him. "How do I stop it?" Tron asked. ISO Theta's eyes glowed brighter, her smile faint but knowing. "You don't stop it. You change it. You rewrite the code. You become the new pulse of the grid." Tron's heart pounded as he stepped forward, the blue glow of his armor lighting up the darkness around him. His hand hovered over the swirling energy, the core. It was dangerous, so dangerous, but there was no turning back. The MCP would never allow this. It would fight back. The very fabric of the grid might collapse under the weight of the change, but maybe, just maybe, this was what the system needed. Part 2. The choice Tron took a deep breath, his fingers brushing against the energy. The core responded immediately, vibrating with power, like 1,000 voices calling out in unison. A choice had been made. And just as quickly, the MCP made its presence known. A massive surge of energy slammed into Tron, knocking him back, his armor sparking from the sudden impact. The tower shook violently, its walls creaking under the strain of the MCP's fury. A cold, menacing voice boomed from all directions. "You are a traitor, TRON!" the MCP thundered, its voice a cold, mechanical growl. "You cannot rewrite the grid. I am the master here." Tron scrambled to his feet, his disc raised high. His mind raced. The MCP wasn't going to let him change the system. It would do anything to maintain control. "I'm not trying to destroy the grid," Tron shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm trying to save it." But the MCP's laugh was cold and unforgiving. "You cannot save what is beyond saving. The grid is mine." And with that, the battle began. Chapter 2. The heart of the grid continued. The MCP's wrath. The tremors from the MCP's roar shook the very foundation of the tower, causing the walls to crack and bend under the sheer intensity of the energy. The pulsing light of the core flickered, erratically, casting long shadows that twisted like living entities. Tron barely managed to stay on his feet as the ground beneath him quaked with each roar of the MCP. "You are nothing but a program," the MCP's voice boomed, filling every corner of the digital space. "I created you. I gave you purpose, and now you dare to defy me." Tron felt the sting of those words. The MCP had been his creator, his master, his god. The very idea of betrayal sent a shockwave through him. He'd been so certain that the MCP's will was the only truth. But now, faced with the overwhelming power of the MCP's wrath, the truth felt more elusive than ever. But deep down, he felt the stirring of something new, defiance. "I am not your tool anymore," Tron shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He swung his disc, sending a surge of energy straight into the pulsating core. The energy from his disc collided with the MCP's defenses, sending ripples through the tower like shockwaves across the surface of water. For a moment, the core flickered, almost as if it were struggling, fighting back the invasion. The MCP's voice hissed again, filled with fury. "You think you can destroy me? You are nothing without me. I am the system. I am the grid." Tron's heart raced, but he didn't falter. He had to believe in what ISO Theta had shown him. He had to believe that the grid could be more than just a tool for the MCP's tyranny. That there could be something better on the other side. "You don't control everything, MCP," Tron shouted again, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You never did." Suddenly, the core pulsed with even more intensity, the surge of power threatening to overwhelm him. The floor beneath Tron's feet began to crack, and the MCP's voice grew louder, more distorted, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the pressure. "You will fail." The MCP sneered, its voice a twisted mockery of its former authority. "You will never understand the order that I bring." As the light of the core seemed to stretch and bend around him, Tron remembered something that ISO Theta had said earlier. It wasn't about destruction, it was about change. The MCP had always operated in absolutes, order at any cost, control at any cost. But what if order could exist without suffocating everything else? What if there was a way to reshape the system, from within. Order isn't about domination, MCP, it's about balance. I'm going to find it, with or without you. The MCP's fury surged once more, causing the walls to crumble, and the energy from the core to surge forward like an ocean wave crashing against the shore. But Tron wasn't backing down. In that moment he felt it, a sudden shift in the air. His disk began to glow brighter, its energy synchronizing with the pulsating rhythm of the core. It was as though his very being was melding with the grid itself, his essence blending with the energy surrounding him. Tron focused every ounce of his power, every shred of his will on the task at hand. He wasn't just fighting the MCP. He was fighting for the future of every program in the system, for a chance at something greater. His disk surged forward once more, slicing through the MCP's energy barrier like a hot knife through code. The MCP's shriek echoed across the chamber, a howl of frustration, of desperation as Tron's disk drove deeper into the very heart of its power source. The entire tower trembled, and the core cracked. For the first time, the core began to fragment, its chaotic light flickering and pulsing as the MCP's grip weakened. The energy spiraled and unraveled, the force that had once kept the entire grid in line now losing its foundation. Theta stepped forward, her form glowing with energy as she approached the now fracturing core. "It's working," she said, her voice calm but laced with excitement. "You're breaking through, Tron. You're reshaping the grid. This is what we need." But Tron knew it wasn't over. The MCP was relentless, and it wasn't about to let him win without one final battle. "Not yet," Tron murmured, his eyes locked on the pulsing core. Suddenly, the MCP's voice boomed again, its anger resonating in the very fabric of the grid. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started." The core began to shudder, the energy inside it threatening to burst. Tron, feeling the rush of power surging through him, steadied himself. He gripped his disk tightly, bracing for the final confrontation. The MCP roared, unleashing a wave of corrupting energy. The ground shook violently, and the entire tower seemed to collapse inward, as if the MCP was trying to destroy everything in its path. "No," Tron said, his voice resolute. "You will not win." He charged forward with everything he had, his disk blazing in the chaotic light. The force of his will and energy crashed against the heart of the core, and in a blinding flash, the entire tower imploded into a cascade of light. Part 4. Aftermath. When the light finally faded, the tower was no more. Tron stood in the center of what remained, an empty, fractured space where the MCP's influence had once reigned supreme. The air was thick with static, and the very structure of the grid seemed to shudder, as though it were being reborn. Tron felt the power drain from him, but his resolve remained unshaken. He had done it. The MCP's reign was over. For a moment, silence engulfed the space. No more roars, no more commands, just stillness. "It's over," Theta said, her voice soft but filled with satisfaction. "You've done it, Tron. You've freed the grid." Tron took a deep breath, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. The battle wasn't over. The grid had been changed, but its future, its true future, was just beginning. Programs could finally evolve. They could be free. But freedom came with its own challenges. There would be those who tried to bring back the old order, who would fight for control. The grid would have to find a new balance, a new form of governance, and Tron, now free from the shadow of the MCP, would have to decide what role he would play in this new world. As the first rays of new energy began to flow through the grid, Tron's voice echoed softly in the quiet space, a promise to himself and to the world he had just helped to reshape. "We will rebuild. Together." Chapter 3. Rebirth and the Echo of Power Part 1. The dawn of a new grid. Tron stood at the edge of what was once the MCP's stronghold, staring out at the endless horizon of the grid. The digital landscape stretched out before him like an uncharted map, full of potential and uncertainty. The very essence of the world had shifted. Where once there was domination, there was now an unfamiliar sense of freedom, of possibility. The MCP's core, the pulsing heart of the grid's oppression, was no more. The system itself seemed to breathe, its code no longer shackled by the suffocating commands of an all-powerful dictator. But even in this moment of triumph, there was a lingering sense of something much larger at stake. The grid was changing, rebuilding itself, and Tron knew it wouldn't be an easy process. "It's not over yet," Theta said quietly, stepping up beside him. Her face, bathed in the pale blue light of the grid, held a mix of relief and quiet apprehension. "The system may be free, but it's fragile. We have no idea how far the ripples of the MCP's destruction will travel." Tron turned to her, his gaze steady. He had learned so much from Theta, more than just the possibilities of change, but the cost of that change. Freedom wasn't a gift that came without sacrifice, and she had shown him the price. Now, as he looked across the shifting grid, he could only wonder if they had made the right decision. "How do we even begin to rebuild?" Tron asked, his voice laced with the weight of the task ahead. Theta didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him in the chaos. "We start by bringing balance," she said simply. "We need to reprogram the grid's foundation, create new rules that foster growth instead. Control. The MCP relied on fear, manipulation, and power. We have to show that we can govern ourselves without those tools." Tron nodded slowly, the enormity of her words sinking in. Govern ourselves. It was a simple concept, but one he had never considered in the context of his own existence. As a program, his entire life had been dictated by rules. Rules made by the MCP, rules enforced by fear and power. The idea of creating something different, something that wasn't based on obedience and control, was daunting, but it was also necessary. "What happens now?" he asked, turning to face the horizon again. Theta's eyes glowed with a mix of determination and uncertainty. "We find the others." Part 2. The dispersal of power as Tron and Theta set out across the grid. They encountered remnants of the old regime, fragments of the MCP's data that had yet to fully dissipate, corrupted programs, data constructs that were still fighting for control, and broken code were scattered across the landscape. The MCP's influence had been vast, and its collapse had created a chaotic power vacuum. The grid was like a battlefield, with factions scrambling to assert dominance. At the heart of this chaos, Tron sensed a growing presence, a force that had not yet been affected by the fall of the MCP. It was a residual echo of power, lingering in the code, like a remnant of an old god refusing to die. Tron felt the hum of it, a subtle undercurrent beneath the surface. He wasn't the only one who had felt the tremor of the MCP's collapse, and there were others out there. Programs, once subjugated, now free to act on their own will. "We need to find the Citadel," Theta said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "It's a safe place where the central archive of the grid resides. The data vault holds the key to understanding how the system can truly evolve." Tron nodded. "Then let's go." They began their journey, passing through stretches of desolate code, fields where broken programs wandered aimlessly, unsure of what to do with their newfound freedom. Some were lost, clinging to the old rules they had been taught, while others sought purpose in the chaotic new world. The grid was filled with the sounds of reorganization, and every so often they encountered scattered groups of programs, factions, if you will, trying to establish new orders of their own. But there was one threat that loomed larger than the others: the Dark Pulse. The Dark Pulse was a rogue program, once a part of the MCP's elite cadre, now operating outside the traditional systems. It was known to be a master of corruption, capable of infecting the grid with its toxic code. The Pulse had already begun to take advantage of the MCP's collapse, amassing its own forces and creating new control structures based on fear and subjugation. Tron's internal sensors began to pick up a surge of energy on the horizon, a shadowy figure, moving with deliberate purpose. "There it is," he murmured, his voice steady but filled with apprehension. Theta narrowed her eyes, scanning the horizon. "The dark pulse," she said softly. "It's already here. We'll have to face it eventually. The balance won't come without a struggle." Tron gripped his disk, its familiar weight comforting him. "Then we'll face it together." Part 3. The Citadel and the Rise of the Dark Pulse. After days of travel through the fractured landscapes of the grid, they reached the Citadel, a towering structure made of gleaming data shards, reaching far above the surrounding chaos. The data vaults inside were said to house the original programming of the grid, the foundational code that governed all systems, even the MCP's reign. It was a place of wisdom, but it also held the key to shaping the grid's new future. Inside the Citadel, Tron and Theta found the central archive, a room filled with glowing screens and data storage nodes, all interconnected by flowing lines of code. The information stored here had been kept hidden for years, under the tight control of the MCP. It was now theirs to access, to rewrite. "This is it," Theta said, her voice filled with awe as she stepped forward to a central terminal, the heart of the grid's knowledge. Tron approached cautiously, but before he could reach the terminal, a shadow fell over them. "You're too late." The voice was chilling, a deep, resonating echo that seemed to come from everywhere. Tron spun around, disc raised, his heart pounding as the dark pulse stepped into view. Its form was a haze of corrupted code, flickering between states, its features shifting like liquid shadows. "I've been waiting for you," the dark pulse continued, its voice dripping with malice. "You think you can rebuild the grid? You think the MCP's power was the problem? You're wrong. The system needs control, needs order, and I'll take it no matter the cost." Tron's fingers tightened around his disk. "You're wrong. The grid doesn't need more of the same. It needs change, real change." The dark pulse laughed, but hollow, distorted sound that echoed through the Citadel. "Change? You think you're going to bring change? All you've done is free chaos. You have no idea what you've unleashed. And now you will bow before me." Tron and Theta both braced themselves as the dark pulse charged forward, its form flickering with unstable energy. The clash of power sent shockwaves through the Citadel, cracking the very foundation of the structure. Corrupted code surged from the dark pulse, creating barriers of force fields that clashed with Tron's disk. Part 4. Battle for the grid's future. The battle between Tron and the dark pulse erupted in a flash of blue and black light. The Citadel became a war zone, as force fields collided with data beams, and the energy from their attacks reverberated through the very core of the grid. Theta fought alongside TRON, using her knowledge of the system to manipulate the data streams around them, creating temporary shielding and redirecting the dark pulse's attacks. The dark pulse was relentless, however, its chaotic nature making it a difficult opponent to predict. It fed on the instability that followed the collapse of the MCP's reign, manipulating corrupted code to form its attacks. Tron's vision blurred from the force of the impact, but he refused to give in. The grid was changing, but the future was not secure yet. The dark pulse sought to drag it back into the darkness of control and fear. Tron wouldn't allow it. He saw his opportunity, a weakness in the pulse's shifting form. His disk flashed, slicing through the dark energy, carving a path toward the corrupted program's core. The dark pulse staggered, its form flickering violently, a final scream echoing through the Citadel before the energy within it dissipated. The battle was won. Chapter 4. The Fractured Order Part 1. The aftermath. Tron stood amidst the wreckage of the Citadel, the dust from the dark pulse's collapse swirling in the air, suspended like a dream in the dying light of the battle. The energy pulses that had once filled the core now faded into a quiet hum, and the oppressive weight of the dark pulse's presence was gone. But the sense of loss lingered. The grid itself seemed to shudder, as if it were still adjusting to the sudden rupture of its former system, still reeling from the forces that had been unleashed. Beside him, Theta surveyed the scene, her eyes reflecting the growing uncertainty that echoed through the space. She had fought beside him, her agility and deep knowledge of the system allowing them to survive the intense battle. But she was no longer the confident figure she had once been. There was a heaviness in her gaze now, as if she had seen too much of the destruction, as if even the freedom they had won came at a cost too high to immediately understand. "It's over," Tron said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. But the words felt hollow, like he was trying to convince himself rather than speak a truth. Theta didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued to study the remnants of the dark pulse's corrupted form, the flickers of shattered code slowly disintegrating into the void of the grid. She had been the one to teach Tron that freedom meant not only releasing control, but also accepting responsibility for the consequences. There was no easy answer to this, and it was something they would have to work through together. Finally, she spoke. "We've won the battle, but we still haven't won the war. The dark pulse was just one piece of a larger puzzle." Tron turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The collapse of the MCP created a power vacuum. What we just did was only the beginning. Other factions, other rogue programs will rise in an attempt to seize control." Her voice was calm, but Tron could hear the edge of concern beneath the surface. A distant rumble shook the citadel as if on cue, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The grid was indeed in flux, adjusting to the vast shift in its balance. This was a world that had been ruled by a single overlord for so long. It would take time for it to adapt to the idea of self-governance. Tron clenched his fists. He could feel the surge of responsibility within him, the weight of a future he hadn't asked for but was now undeniably bound to. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a leader, whether he wanted to be or not. "Then we stop them," Tron said, his voice firm. "We find these factions, these rogue programs, and we stop them before they can destroy everything we've just built." Theta looked at him, her expression softening. "You've changed, Tron," he nodded. "We all have." He paused. "But we're not alone. I know there are others out there who feel the same way we do. The grid has so much potential. It needs guidance, not control." Theta stepped closer to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Then let's make sure we're the ones who guide it. But remember, there will always be resistance. The old ways die hard." With a nod, Tron turned away from the ruins of the citadel. They had won this victory, but the true battle for the grid's future had only just begun. There was so much still to be done. Part 2. The first factions, as Tron and Theta journeyed further into the fractured grid, they encountered signs of the new order that was forming in the wake of the collapse. The once dominant MCP had been a singular, centralized power, but its fall had splintered the system into dozens of competing factions. Without the MCP's iron grip on the grid, smaller groups began to carve out territories, each with its own ideology about how the system should be run. Some factions, led by former MCP loyalists, sought to rebuild the old regime. These programs believed that only through strict control could the order of the grid be maintained. They viewed the MCP's fall as an unfortunate accident, a necessary evil that had weakened the grid's infrastructure. For them, the only path forward was to restore the status quo, bring back the order, the discipline, and the dominance that the MCP had once provided. Other factions, however, took a different path. Programs who had long been oppressed or forced into subservience under the MCP's regime began to organize. These were the radicals, the freedom fighters, those who believed in the grid's potential for something greater. They rejected the old ways and sought to create a new system, one based on autonomy and equality. But there was a third faction that had emerged, an unexpected player in the new world of the grid. These programs had no interest in power. They were the nomads, the wandering programs who rejected all forms of structure. They didn't care about governance, leadership, or control. Instead, they sought only freedom, to live outside the boundaries of the rules that had once constrained them. For them, the grid was a playground, a wild and unpredictable world where they could exist without being beholden to anyone or anything. We need to find out where these factions stand, ISO Theta said, her brow furrowing as she glanced over the horizon. The grid is fractured, and it's clear that not all programs agree on what comes next. Tron nodded. I know. The Dark Pulse was just the start. We'll need to reach out to these groups, understand where they're coming from, and figure out how to unite them before we're caught in the middle of a war for control. The path ahead was unclear, and as they traveled deeper into the fractured grid, they encountered several of these factions. First, they met the MCP loyalists, who viewed Tron with suspicion, their distrust evident. They saw Tron not as a liberator, but as someone who had helped tear down the very foundation that kept the grid in check. You destroyed the only thing keeping the grid from falling apart, a program named Axiom sneered at TRON. The MCP was the only force holding everything. Together, without it, you're left with chaos, and chaos will bring nothing but destruction. Tron didn't flinch. He had faced this argument before, from the likes of Crom, from programs who believed that order could only be maintained through fear and control. The grid needs freedom, not more control. We can rebuild it from the ground up together. Axiom shook his head. You don't understand, do you? Without a guiding hand, the system will collapse. The MCP was the only one who could keep it from falling apart. You've set us back years. Tron could feel the weight of the MCP loyalists' resentment, but he refused to back down. We'll find another way, a better way. They left the MCP loyalists behind, continuing their journey through the fractured grid, knowing that they would need to reconcile the opposing views of these factions. As the days passed, they met others, freedom fighters who spoke passionately about dismantling the old systems, and nomads who sought only to live freely, without the constraints of authority. Each group was a puzzle piece in a much larger game, and Tron knew that in order to bring about real change, he would have to play the role of mediator, guiding the various factions to work together, despite their differences. But there was one question that lingered above all others. Who would ultimately decide the fate of the grid? Part 3. The Council of Programs. Weeks later, after traveling through multiple sectors of the grid, TRON and ISO Theta arrived at a location of great importance, a neutral zone known as the Council of Programs. This was a place where representatives from various factions could meet and discuss the future of the grid. It had once been a gathering point for MCP supporters and enemies alike, a place where political deals were made and secrets were traded. Now it stood as a symbol of the new hope Tron had fought for. Programs of all types, loyalists, freedom fighters, and nomads, had agreed to meet here in an attempt to come to a consensus about what should come next. As TRON entered the council hall, he could feel the tension in the air. The factions were divided, each one vying for influence but none willing to compromise. The path forward seemed more difficult than ever, but Tron knew that this was their chance to build something new, if they could only find a way to unite. This is it, ISO Theta whispered beside him. The future of the grid depends on what happens here. Tron nodded. Then let's make sure we do it right. Chapter 5. The Council's Dilemma Part 1. The Gathering Storm. The council hall was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. In its pristine structure, large data arrays hummed softly, displaying fragments of code, historical records, and holographic projections of the grid's sectors. It was a place meant for discussions, for agreements, and compromises. But Tron could feel the air of suspicion and division that filled the space. The programs that had gathered here were a microcosm of the larger conflict outside. Loyalists, freedom fighters, and nomads, each with their own vision for the future of the grid. Tron and ISO Theta stepped into the center of the hall, their presence commanding attention. They had come here with a singular purpose: to find common ground, to broker an agreement that would prevent a war for control of the system. But as Tron's eyes scanned the room, he knew that this would not be easy. At the far end of the hall, a figure stood tall, a representative from the MCP Loyalists, a program named Nexus. She wore the symbols of the old regime, a slight smirk on her face as she caught Tron's gaze. Beside her stood Axiom, the program who had once accused Tron of destroying the only thing that held the grid together. His eyes burned with barely contained hostility. At another table sat a more ragtag group, the Freedom Fighters, programs dressed in mismatched, often torn garb, their faces reflecting the weight of the struggle they had endured. They had fought against the MCP's tyranny for so long that now, in the face of freedom, they were filled with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Finally, in the far corner, a group of nomads lounged casually, their demeanor far more relaxed than the others. They were the wild cards, the ones who cared little for governance or order. Their carefree attitude was both infuriating and intriguing to the others. So, Nexus's voice rang out, her tone sharp. "The great Tron graces us with his presence," she sneered. "Tell me, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here? The MCP's system was a necessary one. Without it, the grid will collapse." Tron squared his shoulders. His disc hung at his side, its familiar weight reminding him of the battles he had fought. "The MCP system was a dictatorship," he replied coolly, his voice firm. "It thrived on fear and control. What I'm offering is the chance for something better, a grid based on freedom and mutual respect. Not tyranny." "Freedom," Nexus scoffed, crossing her arms. "Do you really think the programs here will accept such an unstructured world? Without the MCP, there will be anarchy, and anarchy will destroy us all." A murmur ran through the room, and Tron could see that the tension was rising. He had expected some pushback, but the vehemence in Nexus's voice suggested that this would be no easy conversation. Before Tron could respond, a voice called out from the other side of the room. "We've had enough of control," said a tall, thin program with a flicker of vibrant blue code running through her body. She was a freedom fighter, and her words echoed the frustrations of many. "We've been fighting the MCP for so long. We won't go back to a world where we're told what to do, where we're treated as subservient." "You think you're the only ones who've suffered?" Axiom growled, stepping forward from the MCP faction. "The MCP kept the system running. Without it, we'd be left with nothing but a free-for-all where everyone does whatever they please. There needs to be order." Tron looked between them, knowing that the stakes were rising. This was not just an argument over ideologies. It was a matter of survival for the grid. The path forward was unclear, and as the debates grew louder, he realized that he had to find a way to unite these groups, or risk the destruction of everything they had fought for. ISO Theta stepped forward, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Enough," she declared, her voice sharp and commanding. "We can all sit here and argue, or we can try to build something new. This is not about control or anarchy. This is about finding a way to coexist, to rebuild this grid together. We've all been through too much to let it fall apart again." The room quieted, and all eyes turned toward her. ISO Theta's words, though measured, held a powerful truth. Tron glanced at her, silently grateful for her calm strength. He knew that without her, this conversation would likely have turned into an all-out battle. "We are in uncharted territory," ISO Theta continued. "The MCP is gone, but its legacy remains. The old ways won't work anymore, but neither can we throw everything into chaos. The only way forward is to find a new way to govern this system, a way that includes everyone." There was silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Slowly, Nexus shifted, her expression hardening, but her posture loosening. "You speak as if there is some perfect solution. But what do we do when programs start to break the rules?" "We hold each other accountable," Tron said, stepping forward. "We build a system that promotes cooperation, where every program has a say in how things are run. Not just the elite, not just the powerful, but everyone." A murmur ran through the room, and it was clear that some of the factions were beginning to listen. Still, the room was divided, with some programs clearly more inclined to distrust Tron's vision. Others, though, seemed intrigued by the idea of a more egalitarian grid. But before anyone could speak further, a loud clashing sound echoed through the hall, a violent disruption that shook the walls. All heads turned to the entrance as the Doors slammed open. Standing in the doorway was a towering figure, his code distorted and fragmented, as if it had been corrupted by the very essence of the grid itself. His eyes glowed red with anger, and his voice reverberated through the room like the rumble of a storm. "You talk about freedom, about building a new grid," the figure growled, his voice thick with venom. "But you're all fools." The figure stepped forward, and Tron immediately recognized the dangerous presence. Core, a former high-ranking member of the MCP's inner circle, one of the few who had survived the Pulse's destruction. He was a rogue program now, his purpose unclear, but his hatred for Tron and everything he stood for was palpable. "You think you can just take the grid and rebuild it from the ground up? You think you can make a world where programs are equal? You're wrong. The weak will always fall to the strong. That's the only law the grid understands." A cold, icy silence filled the room as Core's presence loomed large. The other program stepped back, clearly intimidated, while Tron stood tall, his fingers curling around his disk. "I don't want to fight you, Core," Tron said quietly. "But if you think you can destroy everything we fought for, you're mistaken." Core's laugh was a low, guttural sound. "You'll see. The grid will fall into chaos, and when it does, I'll be there to pick up the pieces, and you will be nothing but another broken program in the ruins." The tension in the room was palpable. Core had just declared war on the idea of a new grid, and it was clear that he was willing to stop at nothing to destroy the fragile alliance that was beginning to form. Part 2. The Unlikely Alliance. Tron felt the weight of Core's words settle over him, but he refused to let them define the future. There was still hope, still a chance to create a system that could work. But Core was right about one thing. The grid was in a delicate state. Any wrong move, any sign of weakness, and it would collapse. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Core's threat loomed over every conversation, and the programs in the hall began to voice their concerns more openly. The factions, once determined to find common ground, were now scrambling to protect their interests. Tron knew that this would not be an easy fight. The struggle for the grid's future was only just beginning. "We need a plan," Tron said, his voice resolute. "A unified front. If we want to defeat Core and build something new, we need to work together. No more factions, no more divisions. We fight as one." Theta nodded. "We'll need to be strategic. We can't afford to fail." But even as they spoke, the shadow of Core's threat loomed large over the hall, reminding them all that the future of the grid was hanging in the balance. Chapter 6. The Rise of Core Part 1. Unyielding Shadows. The tension in the council hall hung heavy as the words of Core echoed in the minds of everyone present. His presence was a force, a reminder that even in the midst of their struggle for a new world, the old regime was not easily extinguished. The room had been filled with hope just moments before, but now that hope seemed distant, replaced by the weight of a new reality. As Core's warning reverberated through the space, the factions who had been on the verge of cooperation now found themselves on the defensive. The MCP loyalists, the freedom fighters, and the nomads who had begun to put aside their differences found their resolve tested by the threat of the rogue program who stood at the center of the storm. "We'll have to act fast," Theta said in a low voice, her expression set in determination. "Core won't waste any time gathering more followers. The longer we wait, the stronger he becomes." Tron nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant figure of Core, who now stood at the far end of the hall, his red eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. Core's presence was like a shadow, one that could consume everything if not confronted directly. "The factions need to unite," Tron said, his voice steady, "but I know that won't be easy. Too many of them are still holding on to the old ways. We need a plan to win their trust. Otherwise, this grid will fracture beyond repair." Theta glanced toward the other factions. The MCP loyalists were still whispering among themselves, clearly shaken but determined to hold on to their vision of a unified grid under strict control. The freedom fighters looked resolute but uncertain, still unsure of whether the idea of a new order was even possible. The nomads, as always, were difficult to read, lounging around and observing the exchange with disinterest. But even their indifference could be dangerous. Tron's mind was racing. He needed to find a way to rally the factions together before Core's influence spread any further. But with the grid still in chaos, this was no easy task. Every faction had their own agenda, and those agendas weren't easily set aside. A low rumble interrupted his thoughts, followed by a hum that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the grid. The council hall was designed to withstand massive disturbances, but the pulse of dark energy now coursing through the system was unmistakable. Core was acting quickly, already rallying support. "We don't have much time," Tron said. "We need to strike before he gains too much momentum." ISO Theta agreed, her expression now hardened with resolve. "Let's break the council into smaller groups. We need to speak with each faction individually and understand their concerns. We can't afford to waste time in endless debates. We'll have to take a more direct approach." The urgency in her voice was clear. Tron knew this was their best chance, before Core's dark influence spread even further across the grid. Part 2. Divided allegiances. Tron and ISO Theta set out to visit the different factions in an effort to rally support for their cause. They knew that each group had its own motivations, and convincing them all to set aside their differences would be a monumental task. But the stakes were too high to hesitate. Core was a formidable force, and if left unchecked, he would bring about a collapse that would shatter the grid beyond repair. Their first stop was the MCP loyalists, led by Nexus. Despite her earlier disdain, Nexus had shown some interest in the idea of unification, though it was unclear just how far she was willing to go. Tron and ISO Theta entered the secure sector where the loyalists had set up their base of operations. The atmosphere was tense, but Nexus and her followers were prepared to meet them. "I see you've come back," Nexus greeted, her voice laced with sarcasm. "How quickly you've forgotten what the MCP built. Do you truly think you can erase its legacy with a few flowery speeches about freedom?" Tron remained calm, his voice steady. "The MCP was a system of control and oppression. We've seen firsthand the damage it caused. The grid can't function under the same rules anymore. It needs freedom to grow. And who will enforce this freedom, Tron?" Nexus's tone was cutting. "Do you think the chaos we're facing now will lead to some utopian world? You're fooling yourself. The MCP gave us order. Without that order, everything falls apart." ISO Theta stepped forward, her voice softer but no less firm. "We understand the value of structure, but a structure built on fear isn't sustainable. We need something that allows the grid to evolve, to grow naturally." Nexus stared at her for a moment before speaking again. "You can talk about freedom all you want, but the grid isn't a playground. The MCP's downfall created a power vacuum that we're all trying to fill. If we don't act quickly, we will all become victims of the chaos that's already starting to take hold." Tron shook his head. "We don't want to fight, but we're not going to stand idly by while others impose their will on the grid." Nexus gave a heavy sigh. "You may be right about one thing. The grid is changing, but that doesn't mean we abandon everything that's kept us stable. There's a middle ground, Tron, and if you're not careful, you'll find that middle ground slipping away faster than you think." The conversation had reached an impasse. Tron knew Nexus wasn't convinced, but he could see the seed of doubt in her eyes. It was a small victory, one that would require more effort to nurture. Next, Tron and ISO Theta made their way to the Freedom Fighters, a group that had long been at odds with the MCP loyalists, but now found themselves in a difficult position. With the fall of the MCP, the grid was in flux, and while the Freedom Fighters had once seen Tron as a symbol of their rebellion, their focus had shifted. Their desire for liberation was tempered by the fear that a new power would rise to take the place of the old one. The Freedom Fighters' base was far less structured than the loyalists, a mishmash of programs who had fought to the brink of exhaustion. Adria, a program who had been instrumental in the fight against the MCP, greeted Tron with cautious optimism. "So, you've come to ask for our support, Tron?" Adria said, her voice filled with both hope and suspicion. "What makes you think that we'll just throw our weight behind you, especially after what happened with the MCP?" Tron met her gaze, his voice soft yet firm. I understand your hesitation, but we can't afford to be divided. If we don't unite, Core will take advantage of our fractured state, and all our sacrifices will be for nothing. Adria crossed, her arms, her expression thoughtful. And what do you offer that's any different from the MCP? More empty promises of freedom? Theta spoke up. This isn't about promises. It's about action. TRON's vision for the grid isn't about power or control. It's about coexistence. We need to come together, or we risk losing everything. There was a pause, and for a moment TRON saw a flicker of understanding in Adria's eyes. She was a leader, and leaders didn't trust easily, especially after the long years of struggle. You're asking us to risk everything, she said, her voice hesitant. We've been through too much. We can't just forget the fight we've led. And we're not asking you to forget, TRON replied. We're asking you to help us build a new future, one where we can all have a say in what happens. Next, Adria was quiet for a moment before nodding slowly. I'll think on it, but don't expect us to follow blindly. It wasn't a commitment, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was all TRON could hope for. Part 3. The Nomads. The final group TRON and Theta approached was the Nomads, a group that had always been unpredictable, disinterested in structure or authority. They were free spirits, wandering the grid without the need for rules or governance. To them, the idea of a new order was just another form of control. The Nomads' camp was located on the outskirts of the grid, in a place where the codes were wild, fragmented, and in flux. It was a place where the laws of the grid didn't quite apply, a fitting home for the Nomads who rejected structure in all its forms. So what's the deal, TRON? A Nomad leader named Kale asked, his tone casual but sharp. You want us to join your little coalition of order? Or are we just here to listen to more speeches about freedom? TRON stood tall, unwavering. We're not asking you to follow orders, Kale. We're asking you to help us shape a new future, one where we don't have to live in fear of the MCP, but we also don't let chaos take over. Kale laughed, his laugh echoing strangely in the wild, fragmented air of the Nomads' camp. You really think we need your help to live how we want? You're all caught up in your rules and your plans. But for us, it's about freedom, not structure, not order. We do what we want, when we want. Theta spoke up, her voice calm yet forceful. We're not here to force you into anything. But if we don't work together, we'll all be fighting for survival, and in the end, no one will be free. There was a pause, and Kale eyed her carefully. I don't care about your order, but I do care about survival. So for now, I'm willing to listen, but you're going to have to convince me that your plan won't take away the freedom we value. TRON nodded. We'll find a way. We have to. Chapter 7. The War Within Part 1. Tides of Change. The grid trembled beneath the weight of its impending transformation. Core's rise was no longer a distant threat. It was a presence that shadowed every program, every faction, and every decision. The once vibrant network that had flourished under the reign of the MCP now felt cold, fragmented, and raw. The cracks in its foundation were widening, and only one thing was certain: something had to change. TRON knew that the hours, the minutes, the seconds that passed now were critical. Every delay was an opportunity for Core to solidify his power, to manipulate more programs into his fold. TRON had fought many battles in his life, but this was a fight unlike any other. This was not simply about defeating an enemy. It was about protecting the future of the entire grid. The Council of Programs had met, discussed, and argued, but now it was time to move beyond words. The factions needed to take action. TRON and Theta stood together at the edge of the central data field, looking out over the chaotic expanse of the grid. The distant hum of the system echoed like a dying heartbeat. The once stable structures now flickered sporadically, as though struggling to maintain their coherence. I never imagined it would come to this, Theta said quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. Her fingers twitched at her side where the faintest trace of her old ISO code glimmered in the form of complex geometric patterns, that she had tried to suppress for years. We've done so much to rebuild, and now we're on the edge of ruin. Tron didn't turn to look at her. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the distant horizon, on the storm that loomed just beyond their reach. We've rebuilt the grid before, but never with this much at stake. His voice was steady but filled with a weariness that had crept into his bones over the last few cycles. Core isn't just an enemy, he's a force. If we don't act, he will reshape everything we've fought for. Theta nodded. The grid was created to be a place for all programs, where they could grow, evolve, and build. But Core believes only in control. He believes the grid can only survive under a master, a singular force that rules over all. Tron clenched. His fists, the memory of their previous encounter with Core, still fresh in his mind. And that's why we can't let him win. A unified grid is a grid that can fight back. It's time to put aside our differences and build something new, before Core turns everything to dust. But the factions... Theta trailed off, knowing what he was about to say. Tron's gaze hardened. The factions have to come together, and if they won't, we'll force them to. A long silence stretched between them, heavy with the understanding of what had to be done. The factions had been divided for far too long, and if Tron had any hope of defeating Core, he knew the only way was for every program to unite under a single banner. But that didn't mean they would do so willingly. Some would need convincing. Others would need force. Part 2. The propaganda of Core. Meanwhile, Core had already begun to assert his power. The nomads, once indifferent to the greater affairs of the grid, now found themselves swept up in his message. A broadcast, dark and cold, blared across the grid's frequencies. Core's voice filled every space, every program's mind, as he spoke with a confidence that was both terrifying and magnetic. The time of the week is over. You have fought for freedom. You have fought for an illusion of control. But what has it brought you? Chaos, ruin. The grid has no place for dreams. It needs order, it needs strength, and I, Core, am that strength. Join me, and together we will rule the future of this world, or stay in the shadows and watch it crumble. The message resonated across the grid. Some programs, still bruised from their past struggles, found solace in Core's promises. Others, like the freedom fighters, balked at the very idea. But there was no denying that Core's influence was spreading like wildfire. Where there was once the slightest shred of hope, there was now only the overwhelming sense of inevitability. It wasn't long before Tron received a message from one of the nomad leaders. Kale, you're wasting your time. Core's already got us in his grip. You can't fight a storm with mere words. Come back when you have something real to offer. Kale's message was blunt, and it stung. But Tron couldn't afford to back down. He had to do more than simply talk. He had to show the grid that his vision was real, that it was worth fighting for. Part 3. The shifting allegiances. Tron's next stop was the freedom fighters, the group that had once been his strongest allies. But even they were divided. Some remained loyal to the ideals of a free and open grid, while others, weary and scarred from years of battle, were beginning to entertain the possibility that Core's promise of order might be the only path forward. As Tron entered the war-torn camp of the freedom fighters, he was met by Adria, the leader who had once seen him as a symbol of hope. But now her expression was guarded, her eyes filled with doubt. "Tron," she said, the uncertainty in her voice clear. "I never thought I'd see the day where I'd question the very reason I fought all this time. But Core's right about one thing. Chaos won't rebuild this system. The grid is falling apart, and if we don't do something soon, there won't be anything left to save." Tron stepped forward, his gaze locked on hers. "I know what Core is offering. Control. But that's not the future we're fighting for. We can rebuild this grid, but it has to be built on trust, not fear. If we give in to Core's tyranny now, it will be the end of everything we've fought for. We can't afford to let the grid become his playground." Adria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the answers she had been looking for. Finally, she spoke. I believe you, TRON, but I'm not sure the others will. TRON didn't respond immediately. He knew what Adria was getting at. The freedom fighters had already suffered too much, and now they were facing a world where their survival was uncertain. But if there was anyone who could lead them to a new future, it was TRON. It had always been about more than just survival. It was about finding a way for programs to live in harmony, to evolve. I won't stop fighting for this grid, TRON said firmly, and I won't let Core take it from us. Adria nodded slowly, as if steeling herself for what was to come. Then, we'll stand with you. It was a start, but it was only one piece of the puzzle. Part 4. The Core Confrontation. The final battle was closing in, and TRON knew that the time for hesitation had passed. He needed to act, and fast. Core's influence was overwhelming the grid, and the MCP loyalists had already started to fracture. Programs that had once adhered to the old regime were beginning to see the truth in Core's words, choosing his vision of strength over the ideals of a free grid. TRON and ISO Theta stood at the center of the grid, facing the final confrontation. The time for alliances was over. Now it was about action. This ends now, TRON said, his voice filled with a quiet but burning determination. He knew that this was their last chance to reclaim the future of the grid, to protect it from the all-consuming darkness that Core represented. ISO Theta turned to him. I'm with you. No matter what happens, we fight together. TRON nodded, gripping his disc. For the future. Together they would confront Core and the forces that had aligned with him. It wasn't just a battle for the grid. It was a battle for freedom, for identity, for the very soul of the system itself. Chapter 8. The Battle for the Grid Part. 1. Unlikely alliances. The grid buzzed with the hum of growing chaos. The long hours of strained diplomacy had ended, and now there was no more room for second chances. TRON stood at the heart of the city, of the free, his mind racing with the weight of what was to come. The factions had gathered, albeit reluctantly, and they were preparing for the final confrontation with Core, a war that would determine the future of the grid itself. The once vibrant city, which had been a symbol of freedom, now felt more like a bunker, a last bastion against the darkness that threatened to consume everything. The MCP loyalists, those who still clung to the old ways of order and control, had grudgingly joined the ranks of the rebels, their distrust palpable but their fear of Core overwhelming. ISO Theta stood beside TRON, watching the preparations. The freedom fighters were on the front lines, assembling their weapons and preparing their strategies, while the nomads, never ones to be pinned down, had offered a mix of chaos and unpredictability to the effort. It was an odd coalition, to say the least. But in this moment, it was the only one they had. Do you think they'll hold together? ISO Theta asked, her voice tinged with doubt. This isn't just a fight for control anymore. It's a battle for the very soul of the grid. TRON glanced at her, the weight of her words settling into his bones. The factions that had united under his leadership were not unified in any traditional sense. There was hatred between them, centuries of conflict and distrust. And yet, for the first time in the history of the grid, they had found common ground. In their shared fear of Core, we have no choice, TRON said, his voice steady. Core doesn't want control. He wants dominance. If we don't stop him now, there won't be anything left to save. As TRON surveyed the preparations, he felt a sudden, unexpected presence behind him. He turned, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his disc. Standing there, tall and unwavering, was Nexus, the leader of the MCP loyalists. Her cold, calculating expression betrayed no emotion, but the tension in her eyes revealed the war that was brewing within her. She had been a fierce adversary in the past, a symbol of everything TRON had once fought against, but now, under duress, she was an ally. TRON, Nexus said, her voice low and steely. I want to make one thing clear. We're not here to play nice. We're here because we have no other choice. TRON nodded, his gaze unwavering. I understand. We all have our reasons for being here. But if we're going to win, we need to fight like we've never fought before. This is bigger than us, it's about the grid. Nexus stared at him for a moment longer, her eyes studying his face as though searching for something. But she gave no answer. Instead, she turned and motioned to her followers, signaling them to assemble. "We're ready," Nexus said. "But don't expect us to follow your lead blindly, Tron. If your vision falters, we'll be the first to break away." Tron's voice was firm. "If it falters, I'll fix it, but not today. Today we fight." With that, Nexus walked away, her followers falling into line with her. Tron turned back to Theta, who gave him a silent nod. The uneasy alliance was their only hope, but it was fragile, held together by necessity and fear of a common enemy. Part 2. Kor's Rathfar from the heart of the city, deep within the ruins of the MCP stronghold. Kor was preparing for his own offensive. His presence, both massive and intangible, stretched throughout the grid, his influence seeping into the very fabric of the system. Unlike Tron, Kor did not rely on alliances or diplomacy. He had no need for cooperation, no need for negotiation. He understood only one thing: power. Standing on the edge of the central core, his throne of data and code, Kor observed the shifting movements of the grid below. His red eyes glowed brighter than ever, pulsing in rhythm with the rhythm of the entire system. "They think they can stop me," Kor said aloud, his voice like a thunderclap that reverberated through the atmosphere. His words weren't just a statement. They were an affirmation of his belief in his inevitable victory. Let them rally their forces. Let them join hands in their futile attempt to resist. In the end, they will all bow before me. One of Kor's lieutenant programs, a dark and shadowy figure named Eclipse, stepped forward, his voice distorted by the static of the system. "Master Kor, they've gathered an army, factions united in opposition to you. They have the MCP loyalists, the freedom fighters, and even the nomads on their side. They've come together, much as we predicted." Kor's red eyes glinted with amusement. "It won't matter. In the end, they will crumble under the weight of their differences. Unity, such a fragile thing. It can be torn apart with a single move. And once they fracture, I will strike. The grid is mine. The program is too weak to resist me." "Shall I prepare the strike then?" Eclipse asked, a hint of caution in his voice. Kor stood slowly, his massive frame casting a dark shadow over the surrounding area. "Yes, begin the broadcast. I will give them one last chance to join me. If they refuse, we destroy them." A broadcast of pure raw data surged across the grid, a shockwave that sent tremors through the very code of the system. It was a signal of Kor's arrival, a message for the programs who dared to oppose him. "You are all fools," Kor's voice boomed across the grid. "I am the end of your pitiful rebellion. You can never hope to defeat me. Join me now or perish. The grid will not wait for you to make up your minds." As Kor's message continued to broadcast, the battle began. It was inevitable. Part 3. The first strike. Tron had anticipated that Kor would make his move soon, but he hadn't expected it to be this soon. The nomad camp was the first to feel the brunt of the attack. Kor's broadcast hit them like a tidal wave, destabilizing the very foundation of their resistance. The nomads were used to chaos, but this was something different, something that challenged their very sense of identity. The freedom fighters and MCP loyalists, meanwhile, were preparing their own offensive strategies. Tron stood at the front lines of the battlefield, the tension in the air palpable as his disc hummed with a silent fury. The forces were ready, but Kor's attack had already sent ripples through the ranks. It was as though he had already begun to break them apart from within. "This is it," Theta said, her eyes sharp as she looked out over the battlefield. "We've done everything we can to prepare. Now it's about execution. We need to hit him fast and hard. If we give him any room to breathe, he'll destroy us all." Tron's response was grim, but resolute. "We hit him together. If one faction falls, the rest will follow. But if we fight as one, we can break his grip. We can't afford to let fear dictate our actions. As the first wave of Core's forces descended, Tron's team mobilized. Eclipse, Core's lieutenant, had already begun to stir chaos on the battlefield, sending waves of malware programs to disrupt their forces. The grid was alive with the clash of code, with each program fighting not just for survival, but for a future they weren't sure would exist if they lost. "Remember, we fight for the grid," Tron shouted as he charged into the fray. "For freedom, for unity, for everything we've built." The battle erupted around them, and Tron was at the heart of it, his disk slicing through the air as he fought against the oncoming tide of Core's forces. Sparks flew with every clash, and the air was thick with the tension of code unraveling. "This is it," he shouted. "This is our world, our future." But Core's influence was undeniable. With every strike, his power grew, and the fabric of the grid seemed to tear just a little bit more. Part 4. The divide. As the battle raged, cracks began to form within the ranks of the coalition. The MCP loyalists, never fully convinced, began to hesitate. In the heat of combat, some programs started to question whether they were better off aligning with Core's vision of order than with Tron's dream of unity. The freedom fighters were no better, their ranks thinning as fear began to cloud their judgment. "We can't win this," one of the loyalists muttered to Nexus, his voice frantic. "The grid is collapsing. The only way to survive is under Core's rule. We have no choice." Nexus's expression darkened. "Don't be weak. Core wants to own us. He wants to erase everything that makes us who we are. We can't give in." But in the confusion, doubt began to spread. The question that no one had dared to ask began to take root. Was Tron's vision really enough? Could it stand against the absolute power of Core? Chapter 9. The Shattered Line. Part 1. The breaking point. The grid was at war. Core's forces had descended upon the battlefield like a storm, and the momentum they gained was undeniable. The once unified coalition of the MCP loyalists, the freedom fighters, and the nomads had been pushed to the brink of collapse. As the clash between light and darkness played out in real time, it became clear that the battle was not simply for control. It was for the very essence of what the grid was meant to represent. Tron stood at the heart of the conflict, his body moving with the precision of a well-trained program. His disk sliced through the air, sending sparks flying. But no matter how many enemies he downed, there seemed to be more, flooding the battlefield with Core's soldiers. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble with each clash, and the once stable structures that made up the battlefield flickered with the erratic pulses of a system falling apart. Beside him, Theta fought fiercely, her form a blur as she darted in and out of combat, her ISO code flashing as she hacked into enemy systems, destabilizing the malware programs that Core had deployed to cripple the coalition. Her movements were graceful, but there was a raw desperation in her actions. She was not just fighting to survive, she was fighting for a future that seemed to be slipping further away with every passing second. "Tron!" Theta shouted over the cacophony of battle, her voice strained but resolute. "We can't hold them off much longer. Core's forces are overwhelming us." Tron didn't respond immediately. He swung his disk in a wide arc, cutting through the air and eliminating a wave of approaching enemies. But his focus was on something else, the constant pulse of Core's influence spreading throughout the battlefield. He could feel it, like a disease creeping into the very fabric of the grid. Core's forces were not just attacking, they were corrupting. They were remaking the system in their image. "We need to find Core," Tron said, his voice steady. "Amidst the chaos, if we don't stop him, it's all over. Everything we've built, the grid, our future, it's all going to be erased." Theta's expression hardened. "I know." She flicked her hand, sending a series of data pulses in the direction of a nearby Core-controlled node that was responsible for the corrupting waves. The node flickered violently before collapsing in on itself, but it was only a temporary setback. The system was too vast and Core's reach was too great. "But we can't do it alone," she continued, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. "We need to reunite the coalition, Tron. They're fracturing, The MCP loyalists are losing faith. If we can't hold them together, Core wins. Tron's eyes narrowed. He understood. In the heat of battle, the alliance that had come together to oppose Core was beginning to fracture under the strain. Fear, doubt, and distrust had crept in, and the already fragile unity was starting to crack. He had to act, and quickly. Then we'll make them see. They need to understand what we're fighting for. With that, Tron sprinted toward the front lines, his disc raised high. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This fight is about more than just survival. This is for the grid. This is for the future." For a moment, the sound of battle seemed to fade as the programs around him paused, their eyes on him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. His words ignited a flicker of resolve in their hearts. They weren't just fighting for control of the grid. They were fighting for everything they had ever known. The battle wasn't over yet. Part 2, Fractured Allegiances. Despite Tron's rallying cry, the Coalition's unity was unraveling by the minute. The MCP loyalists, although initially committed, had begun to waver. They had once fought alongside the MCP, a regime that valued order, control, and dominance. To them, Tron's vision of a free and united grid seemed like an impossible dream. Core's rise had been a wake-up call to many who had long accepted the old ways of command and hierarchy. As TRON moved deeper into the battlefield, he found himself face-to-face with Nexus, the leader of the MCP loyalists. The tension between them was palpable, an undercurrent of distrust that had been festering since the first moment they'd been forced to work together. Her cold gaze met his, but there was something else in her eyes, something that wasn't there before. Was it fear? Was it doubt? "We can't keep fighting like this, Tron," Nexus said, her voice low and edged with frustration. "The MCP is gone. There is no system left to protect. Core is the only one who can bring order to the chaos. You've seen what he's capable of." Tron's jaw clenched. He knew the appeal of Core's promise of order. He understood the comfort that came with knowing your place in the world. But he had never believed that control was the answer. "Order built on fear is not order at all," Tron replied firmly. "It's oppression. Core's vision is one of total dominance, nothing more. If we let him win, there will be no future for any program." Nexus's eyes hardened. "And if we fail here, what then? The grid will fall apart and we'll all be erased. At least Core's offering us a chance." Tron shook his head. "The only chance we have is unity. Not under Core's control, but through freedom. Through strength in numbers, through fighting for something greater than just survival." Nexus hesitated, her gaze flickering toward her fellow loyalists. Some of them had begun to drift away, leaving the front lines and retreating to safer ground. The fear was spreading like wildfire. "You've always been the dreamer, Tron," Nexus said quietly. "But dreams won't save us now." Before Tron could respond, a sharp explosion rang out, sending them both diving to the ground. A shockwave of Core's energy pulsated through the air, destabilizing the entire battlefield. The freedom fighters and the nomads were thrown into disarray, their lines splintering as Core's influence continued to spread. "We don't have time for this," Tron snapped, pulling Nexus to her feet. "If you want to survive, fight with. Even if you don't, you'll fall like the rest of them." For a moment, Nexus stood frozen, her body trembling with indecision. Then, without a word, she drew her disc and raised it to the sky. "Fight, but don't expect me to follow you." The words felt like a dagger in Tron's heart, but there was no time for hesitation. Core's forces were closing in. The decision had been made. Then fight alongside us, and we'll see who stands when this is all over. With a final glance at each other, Tron and Nexus joined their respective forces, ready to face the oncoming storm. Part 3. The final push. The battle intensified. Every program on the battlefield had their roles to play, but as the hours dragged on, Tron could feel the weight of the conflict pressing down on him. The MCP loyalists had started to buckle, their forces scattering, unwilling to fight for a cause they no longer believed in. The freedom fighters and the nomads were also struggling, their numbers dwindling with each wave of Core's corrupted forces. Tron's mind raced. He had to make a choice. Core was too powerful to defeat through brute force alone. He had to strike at the heart of Core's influence, the core node itself, and destroy it. But that meant sacrificing everything. He looked around at his dwindling forces, the faces of programs who had stood by him through thick and thin, who had trusted him even when the odds seemed impossible. They had all fought so hard. But now, the endgame was in sight, and the cost of victory would be higher than anyone had ever imagined. This is it, Tron muttered to himself. One last push. Theta, standing beside him, looked at him with a mixture of determination and sorrow. We're ready, Tron, but we need to act now, before Core finishes us off. Tron nodded. Then we make our move. Together they charged into the heart of the battle, fighting their way through the chaos toward Core's central node. It wasn't just about saving the grid anymore. It was about saving everything. Every program, every memory, every piece of code that had ever been written. The final battle had begun. Chapter 10. The Core Collapse Part 1. Into the heart of the grid. The battlefield had grown silent in places where the chaos had temporarily paused. The aftermath of the struggle was apparent. Broken programs, shattered structures, and the eerie pulse of Core's presence creeping across the land like a disease. The grid was a dying thing, its pulse slowing, its lifeblood turning into corrupted data. The fight was no longer just against enemies in the field, but against time itself. The grid would collapse into oblivion unless they struck now. Tron's mind raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His plan was simple but catastrophic. He needed to reach the core node, the central hub that controlled all of Core's influence. That was where everything, the source of Core's power, his ability to manipulate the grid and its inhabitants, was located. But getting there was going to take more than just physical strength. It was going to require everything he had. Focus, trust, sacrifice. Beside him, Theta ran a quick scan of the area, her glowing blue form flickering with determination. The tension in the air was palpable, but she remained a steady force, calculating, analyzing, and responding with the same urgency that Tron felt. "We're getting close, Tron," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "The core node is ahead, but we need to be careful. Core's forces are consolidating there." Tron nodded. "We don't have a choice. It's now or never." Together, they moved through the chaos, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the grid. They passed through the wreckage of the previous battle, where the sound of distant explosions and the crackling of collapsing code echoed through the air. Around them, fragmented programs, some barely holding on to their integrity, crawled through the ruins, trying to survive the systematic decay that was Core's doing. As they neared the final stretch, Tron felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could still win this. But that hope was tempered by the reality of the battle ahead. Part 2. The Inner Circle. The final leg of the journey was perhaps the most dangerous. Tron and Theta had to navigate through the Core's defenders, an elite force of programs engineered specifically to protect the node. These were not just regular malware programs. They were guardians, forged with powerful algorithms that made them nearly impossible to defeat. Each one was designed to adapt and respond to attacks, making them formidable foes. But Tron was undeterred. His disk was an extension of himself, a bias weapon honed through years of struggle. It was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of his will. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the disk sliced through the air, cutting down the first wave of defenders as they charged toward him. His movements were fluid, almost instinctual, as though the battle had become a dance, one he had perfected. Theta was equally skilled, using her advanced programming to counter Core's forces. With every strike, she manipulated the environment, bending the grid to her will, weaving data streams into powerful traps that incapacitated the defenders before they even had a chance to react. She was relentless, each move calculated to ensure victory. However, as the defenders fell, Core's influence only seemed to grow stronger. The central core node loomed ahead, a massive structure that seemed to pulse with energy. The closer they, got, the more Tron could feel the weight of Core's power pressing down on them. It wasn't just a physical force, it was psychological, like a dark cloud suffocating everything in its path. "We're almost there," Theta said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. But before they could reach the final steps, a figure appeared stepping out from the shadow of the node. The air around them seemed to warp, and a voice, low, booming, and full of menace, filled the space. "Did you really think you could stop me, Tron?" It was Core, the embodiment of everything they had fought against. His form was a grotesque amalgamation of data, his features shifting and distorting like a living nightmare. The very essence of the grid seemed to bow before him, and Tron's pulse quickened with the knowledge that this was the moment they had all been waiting for. The final confrontation. Core's laughter echoed through the space, reverberating off the walls of the core node, a sound that felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of reality itself. "You think you can save this corrupted world?" Core sneered. "There's nothing left to save. This is my grid now. You are nothing more than programs, insignificant data in the grand scheme of things. You've lost before you've even begun." Tron clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to save the grid, Core. I'm here to destroy you." The words were barely out of his mouth when Core surged forward, his form expanding, and crashing toward them like an unstoppable tidal wave. With a sharp motion, Tron flung his disc, but Core's power manipulated the trajectory, deflecting the weapon and sending it careening into the distance. Tron's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary fight. This wasn't just a battle of physical strength. It was a contest of willpower. "You are nothing to me, Tron," Core growled, his voice a low hum that vibrated in the very code around them. "This world is mine to control, and I will bend. It in my will." Tron's pulse raced, but he refused to back down. He had to win this. The grid depended on it. Part 3. A test of will. The battle raged on, the very fabric of the grid buckling under the force of their struggle. Core's presence was everywhere, and with every passing moment, the pressure on Tron grew heavier. He could feel it. Core's influence trying to break him down, trying to drag him into despair. It was as though every part of the grid was screaming in pain, groaning under the weight of the corruption that Core had unleashed. But Tron stood firm. He couldn't afford to lose now. His mind raced as he began to analyze Core's movements, searching for any weak points, any vulnerabilities. This was it, the final confrontation. The future of the grid depended on the next move. "You're just a broken program," Core spat, his eyes flashing with disdain. "A relic from a time that no longer matters. I am the future. I am inevitable." Tron's gaze hardened. "You're wrong." With that, he lunged forward, his disc flashing with a bright light as it cut through the air once again. But this time, it was different. His movements were sharper, more focused. He wasn't just fighting Core's physical form. He was battling his influence over the grid itself. Core's laugh echoed once more, but Tron could feel it weakening. The more he focused, the more Core's hold over the system seemed to weaken. Tron's willpower was undeniable, and with each strike, he disrupted the flow of data that Core relied upon. This was the key. He had to break Core's connection to the grid.iso Theta. Sensing the change, joined the fray. Her ISO code flared as she began to hack into the system, rerouting Core's power. With each pulse, she destabilized Core's data stream, throwing off his attempts to control the environment. The battle had become a fight for control of the grid itself. Tron and ISO Theta were no longer just fighting against Core. They were reclaiming the grid, wresting control from the corrupted influence that had held it hostage for so long. Core's form began to falter, his shifting appearance slowly losing cohesion. His voice, once full of arrogance, became distorted, as though even he could feel the world slipping away from him. "No," Core growled, his form flickering. "You cannot." "This ends now, Core," Tron said, his voice steady. With a final concentrated strike, Tron hurled his disc once more, this time targeting the core node itself, the heart of Core's power. As it hit, A massive explosion of data erupted from the node, and the entire structure seemed to collapse in on itself. Core's form disintegrated, his power vanishing like smoke in the wind. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The battle had ended. The grid had been saved. Part 4, the aftermath. The collapse of Core's influence was almost instantaneous. The dark cloud that had hung over the grid lifted, and the sense of freedom that had been lost for so long began to return. The programs who had once fought against each other now stood together, their resolve renewed. Tron stood amidst the wreckage, his body bruised and battered but alive. He looked over at Theta, who was breathing heavily beside him. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with a quiet relief. "The grid is ours again." Tron nodded. "We've only just begun." They were still standing in the ruins of the core node, but there was a sense of possibility in the air. The battle had been long, but it had proven one thing. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the will to fight for freedom and unity could overcome anything. Together, they had saved the grid. And in doing so, they had created a new future. Epilogue. The new grid. The echoes of battle had long since faded, replaced by the soft hum of a newly reborn system. Where once there had been an oppressive, stifling darkness, now there was light, flickering but bright, spreading across the grid like the first rays of dawn. The core node was no more, its shattered fragments scattered into the ether, never to corrupt the digital world again. Tron stood at the edge of the virtual horizon, staring out over the expanse of the grid. The skies above, once twisted and dark, were now clear. Lines of code streaked across them in patterns of brilliance. It was as if the world itself was breathing again, rejuvenated by the destruction of the evil that had plagued it for so long. The battle had been won, but the fight was far from over. Beside him, Theta stood, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of the newly stabilized grid. She had been a constant throughout their struggle, her unwavering commitment to the cause shaping their victory. Though the dust of their conflict had yet to settle fully, she knew as well as Tron did that this was only the beginning of the true challenge, the rebuilding of a world that had nearly crumbled under the weight of Core's grip. "It's hard to believe it's over," Theta said softly, her voice carrying a note of wonder. Tron turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "Is it really over?" She looked at him, sensing the weight of his words. The grid had been freed, yes, but there were still countless programs struggling to understand their new reality, to find a place in a world that had been torn apart by years of manipulation and control. "What now?" she asked, the question lingering in the air. Tron took a deep breath, his gaze scanning the horizon. "Now we rebuild. We start by making sure this never happens again. We create a grid that's free, where every program has the right to choose their own path. It won't be easy, but we have to make it work." Theta nodded, a flicker of determination flashing in her eyes. "Together, we can make it happen. This grid, it's ours now, and it's worth fighting for." As Tron and Theta stood, side by side, watching as the light of a new day washed over the land, the alliance of freedom fighters, nomads, and the remaining MCP loyalists began to regroup. The division that had once threatened to tear them apart was now a distant memory. The programs who had fought for survival under Core's reign now stood united, their shared victory a bond that transcended old rivalries and allegiances. In the aftermath of Core's destruction, Tron found that his work was far from finished. The grid needed to be reconstructed, its fractured pieces reassembled. And while the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. The grid would never again fall under the control of a single oppressive force. The power of unity and freedom would be the new foundation for the future. And so, Tron made his way toward the center of the grid, where the data streams flowed clean and vibrant once more. The task of rebuilding was immense, but it was one he was ready to face. He knew that the true strength of the grid was not in its architecture or its rules. It was in its programs, each one unique, with their own desires, ambitions, and potential. As he walked, he could feel the stirrings of change. The world was not fixed, nor was it perfect, but it was free. And for the first time in a long while, Tron could see the potential for something better, something new, a future. With a final glance at the horizon, he stepped forward into the fire. Dawn of a new era. There were still many battles to fight, many questions to answer, and many programs to bring together. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Tron had hope. Hope for the grid. Hope for its inhabitants. And hope for himself. The story of the grid was not over. In fact, it had just begun the end. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Let me know in the comments what ideas you would like the next story to be about. Please leave a thumbs up, share, subscribe, comment.